let's move to this story. This is the UK's leading think tank Policy Exchange have said that Britain needs an emergency census after a record 3.9 million influx during the Boris wave, warning that immigration-driven growth will strain housing, services and social cohesion. It's that last point, by the way, that I always think gets almost left out of the discussion, and yet it's so crucial. Boris Johnson's Liberal policies pushed net migration to a record 944,000 in the year to March 2023. We remember it well. Let's get a word from Dr Rakib Ehsan, who is Senior Fellow at the Policy Exchange. Good afternoon to you, Rakib. Always good to get your thoughts on this. I mean, you know, tell us something we didn't know in many respects, but here it is. You guys have done some brilliant work, and there is something in this, isn't there? Because these numbers were so big and continue to overshadow this debate that they've, in effect, they've sort of falsely, well, in fact, our readings of population and requirements and social needs, etc., are out of whack now because of these numbers.
No, absolutely, Ian. And I think that the point to make is that we've witnessed unprecedented levels of immigration-driven population change. Now, you mentioned the figure there between June 2021 to June 2024, largely the result of the liberalisation of post-Brexit visa rules under the Prime Ministership of Boris Johnson, witnessed the arrival of over 3.9 million migrants in the form of long-term international immigration. And I think that the big point to make here is that we have not witnessed that level of population growth before, that immigration-driven population growth. Yeah. But what's really important to make is that it's even quicker. It's been even larger in certain parts of the country. And I think that's where we really need to have this discussion about the impact it's having on public services, social cohesion, and more generally, the social fabric of our country at large.
And there is, I mean, we talk about these subjects, as you know, Rakib, on a daily basis. There's so many interconnecting issues, whether, you know, language issues, social cohesion, as we were just talking about. The obvious ones are like schools and, you know, the NHS and this sort of area. Housing in particular, I mean, is right up there. But you know, you might think this is so serious that it would sort of be hitting the front pages on a daily basis. It's almost as if we've just got used to this.
No, I think that's a problem. This situation should not be normalised. And I think that a big part of this report, why we're proposing an emergency census specifically for England, because the population growth has been especially large in England compared to the other home nations, is because that we traditionally have a reputation for being a relatively successful multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy. But now that is very much at stake because of recent developments connected to immigration. And I think the important point to make here is that census population data traditionally is used in terms of calculating how tax revenue should be distributed in order to allow for the precise and effective delivery of public services. So a big part of this emergency census is actually looking at where are we most vulnerable when it comes to critical forms of infrastructure where public services simply aren't keeping up with the pace of population change and the kind of strain that can create between different communities in relatively deprived parts of the country.
Indeed. It costs an arm and a leg, of course, to do a census, as we know from the last one. And, of course, there's all sorts of issues around getting the right questions, etc. So is this just a notional idea, or is there a serious push for a recount, if you like, as to who the heck lives here?
Well, I think that the cost point is a very important one, which is why we've recommended a 10% national sample. Now, this was also used in the 1966 mid-decade census, which was held under very similar circumstances. There's public concerns over the scale of Commonwealth migration, but also internal movement between the northern regions to southern England. So if you use a 10% national sample, but you have a select number of what we call special sort of case study areas. So we selected 5 areas: Preston, Middlesbrough, Leicester, my hometown of Luton and Bournemouth. Then you're able to keep the cost low, but also to have a very comprehensive and insightful reading into how our population has changed in the last few years.
Well, we'll keep an eye on this, because I think most people would agree that there is definitely a need to, revisit numbers for very serious. It's not a mischievous endeavour. This is for very serious and crucial reasons to, the future of how our country runs. While you're with us, I'd love to get your word on this. The Met Police and Greater Manchester Police taking action on placards and chants. We've had some horrendous things happen. We know that the kind of anti-Israel protests, even after the Manchester synagogue attack, took place on that day, on that evening even, just round the corner from where these attacks happened. And similarly, after what happened on Bondi Beach, lots of protests still taking place. Those shouts of globalise, the intifada have happened as well. This is extraordinary stuff, but we're now hearing from two large police forces that they may well be cutting down and clamping down on those that wave these placards and shout these slogans.
Well, I think that recent terrorist attacks have very much underscored the reality that Islamist extremism does not only represent the principal terror threat in the UK, it represents the primary global terror threat. And I think, in a way, just going back to the pros of an emergency census, I think one thing that we really need to understand in our own country is particular areas, what we call high-risk areas, which could be defined by worsening forms of religious and cultural segregation, and how that might be contributing towards Islamist extremism. And in those segregated Muslim communities, you have heightened levels of anti-Semitism. So I think that's a very important reason as to why we really need to have an emergency census, really understand how our country has changed, and in some ways certainly not for the better.
Yeah, it wouldn't be that long ago, would it, Rakib, where if you'd have explained to people 15 years ago that we would have these kind of protests on our streets, nobody would have believed you. It would have been extraordinary that we'd have had such, almost rabid, sometimes dangerous, often violent protests, with the most awful things being chanted and written on placards, and getting a free pass while doing so, all for something that is happening in a different part of the world.
Well, for some time I've expressed concerns over anti-Semitic elements of pro-Palestine demonstrations, and I think some of those elements were fundamentally under-policed, especially in the earlier stages of those demonstrations taking place. And on top of that, there was the displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia as well at some of these protests and demonstrations. So I think that what we really need to look at here is that how these protests and demonstrations have actually in some ways weakened the wider pro-Palestine movement, and how it's created an atmosphere of intimidation for British Jewish communities. And I think irrespective of one's position on what is going on in the Middle East, it doesn't justify the kind of lethal anti-Semitic violence that we've witnessed both at home and abroad.
Yeah, spot on. Rakib, thank you for your time, sir. Rakib Ehsan, Dr Rakib Ehsan, Senior Fellow with the Policy Exchange. Thank you to him.